The Christian community is on scale the most persecuted community around the world.
It is the Palestinian Authority that says if you are Muslim and you convert to Christianity, you've earned the death penalty.
The fastest growing Christian community is in Iran.
I don't believe that you can be a biblical Christian and not vote.
What has happened to the churches that seem to have been radicalized?
Gen Z has been so indoctrinated on this issue.
Liberal divinity schools in the United States of America.
I'm really glad you're saying that.
Inherently anti-Christian.
We have to expose them. Johnny, Dr. Jeff, welcome back to PragerU. I know it may seem random why I wanted to bring both of you in here, but I think very soon everybody's going to figure out that I have an important conversation to have with both of you. And so welcome back. For those who don't know you, I'm going to share a little bit about my experience and our relationship, and then I'll let you just introduce yourselves as well. And Johnny, you and I go way back. I think we just realized probably 10 years. I got to know you when you were doing work around the world with Christians who were persecuted everywhere. And it was a huge concern of mine and a concern of yours. And so we did incredible work on that side, just notifying the world about the evil that we saw. And you've done a bunch of stuff with PragerU. And so proud of our work together. And Dr. Jeff, you've done many videos with us, which many of them have been incredibly popular. But I would say that the most significant part that you've played in my life was that when we released our interview with Chloe Cole, the young girl who was really manipulated into chemically and surgically castrating herself in the name of the trans movement and was, convinced that she was born in the wrong body. We released this episode and I must have received thousands of emails from parents who were really concerned about their own children and they didn't know how to speak with their Gen Zers about this evil that was happening. And when I didn't quite know what to say to them as far as how to address it and how to stop it, the first thing that came to my mind was Summit Ministries. And so I would send them to you and say, look, I'm here to pray for you, but Dr. Jeff might have something for your family that could help. And so I continue to send people to you when it comes to issues of mental health and families who just have a gaping God-sized hole in their heart. And I know that you've helped so many families. And so I just want to start by just saying thank you. And I love you both. And I'm just so honored that you're here today. And let's get into it. Let's fight some evil together during this conversation.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, Jeff, maybe you can just describe a little bit what you do, because I talked about Summit Ministries, and I'm sure many people are now curious about it, and we can go from there.
Well, I equip and support the rising generation. So this is Gen Z. Those are between 12 and 27 years of age, to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview. We don't want students to go out there and feel that they need to be afraid in the culture or reticent. We want them to be courageous and compassionate people who learn to become leaders. We primarily do it through 2-week-long conferences in Colorado and in Georgia every year, as well as through curriculum courses for Christian schools, homeschool co-ops, even release time programs in public schools and things like that. It involves apologetics. How do we know that there is a God? How do we know the Bible is true? But then it's also, all right, so what does that have to do with economics and sociology and psychology and all these other areas? And that's how we're able to help so many parents who are struggling with kids trying to figure out how to make their way in the culture that we have.
Yeah, it is so hard to speak to your own children sometimes, especially if they're teenagers. And it's hard to not come across like you're towering over them and lecturing them, and somehow
it's such a great point. It's so easy in theory, right? Yeah. You can have all the strategies, but learning how to relate to your own kids primarily comes about through asking questions and getting them to talk. That's the toughest thing that parents have to do. And my main advice for them is never underestimate the value of looking dumb. Just ask the question. Well, I've never heard of that before. And, you have to explain that to me because I don't get it. And then let them inform you about what's going on, and it starts the conversation.
Yeah, both Johnny and I have kids around the same age. And so how do we make sure that we're not towering over them and preaching to them when sharing important advice with them? And so, Johnny, share with us a little bit what you do and the type of good that you brought to the world.
Yeah, well, before I do, I should say, one of the incredible things about what both of you do is that you make information available to those that are looking for it. And, when I was my kid's age, my parents went through a traumatic experience, and I began to doubt so much of what I believed. And it was a series of apologetics teachers, that as I was always a curious kid, so I had big questions, and for me it wasn't enough to just feel like I was my Christianity. I had to make sure my brain aligned with it. And my church wasn't available. My parents are going through a personal crisis. We got kicked out of the private school we were in because we couldn't pay the bill any longer. We were in poverty. And I went to some books, and as this curious young child who had to have my questions answered, it wasn't enough to feel like faith mattered. It was apologetics, these reasons, rational reasons to believe. And so I'm not sure I would be doing any of my work had it not been that I was able to find resources like both of you produce and make available. And as for my work, I'm probably best known for what I do around the world to help persecuted people. And so persecuted Christians, the Christian community is on scale the most persecuted community around the world. But I help people everywhere. And I think religion can play a constructive role. There's a lot of talk about how religion throws oxygen on fires. But in my experience, religion is actually a key to making peace around the world, as well. So I'm a tent maker like the Apostle Paul was. He had a job and used the job to fund what he does, and that's what I do. I'm a business person. I preach sermons in churches. I write books, but I feel like I'm alive in order to be a voice for those who don't have a voice. And I think that's really what drives me. Every day when I wake up, if I'm looking at the news of the day or deciding how I'm going to invest my limited time and resources, we have to hand a better world to the next generation.
Wow. And that takes a lot. It takes a lot of work and a lot of courage, right? I'd love to get into evangelical Christianity a little bit because, many of us who are living here in the United States of America talk about evangelicals all the time. And I think that maybe some of us are a little confused and there are some holes in our understanding of evangelical Christians. With that said, we're all aware of a very large segment of our population being evangelicals. And you hear about evangelicals especially during voting season, right? It's like, how are they gonna vote? What are they gonna do? And so will you just give us a brief explanation of the status of evangelical Christians in America and I guess a little bit of the background?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with some numbers and then I'll make some observations. So there are about 80 million evangelicals in the United States. It may be pushing 90 million. They're 10 times that around the world. So 700 to 800 million. It is by far, by a mile, the fastest growing Christian community in the world. It's the second largest Christian community. It used to be that the Catholic Church was first, and then the Protestant movements, and then in the Orthodox Church. While evangelicalism is sort of a branch of Protestantism, it's really become its own thing. But what's super interesting about it, Marissa, is that there's no evangelical pope. Okay, there's something. Sometimes when I'm trying to explain to my secular friends who aren't religious like I am, why are there so many evangelicals? And I actually draw a comparison to the free market in the United States of America, because as a evangelical pastor, you don't have to ask anyone permission to start a church, to start a school. You don't have to go to the bishop or the archbishop or the pope. You can just do it. And by the way, if your church is all of a sudden it's not teaching the Bible, or crazy things are being taught to the kids in Sunday school, or there's some issue in the leadership, well, you can just go start another church, a mile down the road. And if that church does a better job of caring for the community and teaching the next generation, it'll grow. And so in the United States of America, in every large city in our country, we have churches that have 10, 15, 20,000 people in those churches. And around the world, we have churches that have 50, 75, 100,000 people in churches. And so the evangelical community is huge. It's a traditional religious community. So it takes the Bible seriously. It takes seriously passing down its values to the next generation. And It's also very powerful politically. It's the single largest electoral bloc in the United States of America. There is no group in the United States of America larger when every election than the evangelical community. And when you look at trends among Latino Americans, for instance, like Latino Americans are moving more towards the right electorally. That's actually largely an evangelical trend. A lot of Hispanic Americans are converting from Catholic forms of Christianity to these evangelical churches. But the last thing I'll say, Marissa, is, I mean, you guys probably remember a few years ago when on The View, I forget the lady on The View. She's older than President Biden, or about President Biden's age, but she has red hair. Joy. Yeah. Not a lot of joy, by the way. But
no joy.
No joy. And I was amazed, that when I saw her and President Biden interacting with one another, but they're the same age, so I get it. But Joy a few years ago said that Mike Pence, the former vice president, was mentally ill because of his Christianity. This was like an observation she made or something like that.
They say the dumbest things on that show. I don't know how we can watch it.
It's crazy. But afterwards, a media outlet asked me Fox News, to comment on it. And I said that Mike Pence's Christianity, evangelical Christianity, is the Christianity of Billy Graham.
Yeah.
It's the Christianity of Billy Graham and Pope John Paul II staring down the Soviet Union. It's the Christianity of the Salvation Army. So there isn't a crisis in the world where the evangelical church doesn't respond. And that goes all the way back to early America.
My question is, so in some ways, I feel like it's like 2 Christians, 3 opinions. So I'm trying to understand, in what way does the theology differ between evangelical Christianity and, let's say, Catholicism or any of the other strands of Christianity? And what makes evangelical Christianity unique?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure you have answers to that question as well, but I'll give a couple. The first one is the hierarchical point that I just made. Like that's a big difference.
No pope.
And the second thing, there are actually some really profound beliefs that evangelicals have that actually make it a very open religion, like our belief in grace. Like most Christians, evangelicals believe that in the original sin, like the fall of man. I think most regular everyday people believe that people were born good and they learn to do bad things along life. We believe the exact opposite. We believe everybody was messed up from the very beginning. Everyone's hopeless. Everyone's, has all kinds of problems. And only by the grace of Jesus and, his death, burial, and resurrection on the cross do we have the forgiveness of our sins. And so it's not a judgmental faith. In fact, Jesus said you shouldn't judge. He's like, the one thing you shouldn't do. And why shouldn't you judge? Because we're all messed up and we all need God. And so evangelicals believe you have to have this like individual salvific experience where you put your faith in Jesus. They believe the Bible is the Word of God. They believe the Bible is inerrant. I mean, these are some of the foundational beliefs, but it's very simple to be an evangelical Christian. You have to come to the end of yourself, and all you need to know is that you can't do anything, but thank God he sent his son to die on a cross and to forgive you. And that's it. And then you're saved. It's what we believe. And then you're part of this amazing global Christian community. So everywhere I go all around the world, I always see our church. And the first hospital in the United Arab Emirates, this amazing modern country, was started by evangelicals who left America to start a hospital. And the presidents of the United Arab Emirates and the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates and the minister of foreign the ambassador to the United States, they were all born in that hospital started by evangelicals. And so it's like this amazing movement all around the world of Christians that know they're messed up. They need God. But the good news is he's there for them because of the story of Jesus.
And they're not doing it because there's some top-down mandate. You've got to do this, and in fact, it's not even because you need to somehow earn your salvation. This is a characteristic of evangelicals is that you actually can't earn it.
You just have to give up.
You have to give up. It has to be given to you by God. I study philosophy.
And it's once and for all. I mean, this is the other thing that's different from a lot of Catholic churches. Like, you have to go and confess your sins at the parish, and on. Like, we don't. My pastor doesn't need to know my sins. Like, it's a relationship that we have with God. I mean, I think it's direct in that way. Yeah.
Dr. Jeff,
I was going to say the philosophers for hundreds of years before Jesus were questioning, how do we know that anything really exists? How do we know the physical world and the world out there are really connected? And they were always looking for, they used this term, the logos. The logos. What's the logos? What makes sense of it all? And the Gospel of John says that what makes sense of it all is Jesus, that in the beginning was the logos, the Word of God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that's core to the evangelical message. So all the things that we've been talking about here make sense and allow evangelicals to even work with people from a lot of other traditions, so that everybody who starts off with the realization that that the truth exists, and it's not just a mathematical formula, it's not just a logical proposition, it's a person, it's Jesus. And then evangelicals have been able to influence every aspect of society, from science to the arts, with that core belief, and work together with people who believe differently for the betterment and the flourishing of humanity.
Yeah, and this is, part of the story in America. I mean, we only have America because people left a country in order to seek religious freedom. And that religious freedom that they were seeking, was a type of Protestant Christianity that led basically to modern evangelicalism. And so, when people start talking about restricting the religious freedom of American Christians, of evangelical Christians, like, this cuts to the very foundation of the United States of America. In fact, it was many of the most famous, revered evangelical institutions in American history. They were leading marches against slavery in the United States of America. I mean, this is evangelicalism, and the religious freedom of evangelicals is it's the first clause of the first sentence of the First Amendment that enshrines our religious freedom. And we don't believe in religious freedom at all unless we believe in religious freedom for all. But when our founders were writing that sentence on that First Amendment and debating all of this, the Christians that they were largely thinking of were the evangelical Christians. That's what they were thinking of. And even when Thomas Jefferson coins the term the separation of church and state, he coins the term in a letter to the Baptist in Danbury, Connecticut, because the Baptists were concerned that the government was going to encroach on their rights. And Thomas Jefferson says, you don't have to worry about that, because in the United States, we have a separation of church and state, which was about the state not being able to control the message and the mission of the church. We flipped the thing on its head.
When I was a kid, my family would drive down the street, and I'd always ask, what do these people believe? What do these people believe? And they were mostly evangelical churches of one variety, some variety. And I thought at the time, isn't that sad that we have all these different churches? But what you brought up earlier, Johnny, I think is so powerful, that there's a free market of religion in the United States. At the time of America's founding, only 17% of the people regularly attended church. Within just 2 or 3 decades, 51% of the population regularly attended church, because they had the freedom to choose how they would worship and organize themselves together in community. It's a tremendous force. I mean, probably $2 trillion of America's economy every year is from the work and the money that evangelicals are giving to help people.
I mean, truly, they have been an engine for so much good. I've also noticed that many of the evangelical churches have moved away from biblical worldviews.
Right.
And people have been critical of the Pope and the Catholic Church, but I don't think it's fair to only criticize them. I criticize Jewish synagogues as well, who have been infiltrated by this woke Marxist ideology. And so I think I'm as a freedom junkie as anybody else is, but at what point do we step in and say what has happened to the churches, including the evangelical churches, that seem to have been radicalized?
Yeah, I mean, there's underneath this problem is a different problem, which is a courage problem. We need a type of courage revival in the churches of America, because what's happened, and by the way, that's biblical. In the Christian New Testament, it says if we care about the opinions of people, we cannot serve Jesus. So I can't be a faithful Christian if I wake up every day and decide what I'm going to believe or what I'm going to do with my life based upon whether it's popular or not. I literally cannot serve Jesus if my number one priority are the opinions of what people will think about me. And yet our entire culture is in that direction. I mean, from the way social media works and all of these things. But then there's an insidious thing that's happened, Marissa, which are political activists who've decided that they disagree with evangelicals on certain political ideas. So they're going to stigmatize the whole community. So like routinely I'm asked, almost every, except for with the home team, let's say, almost every interview, every conversation I have, aren't you guys a bunch of Christian nationalists? Right. This is.
By the way, they call me that too, a white Christian nationalist Barbie.
Do they really?
They do.
Wow. You should get a bumper sticker.
Instead, I have a dress, a pink one.
It's fantastic. You should get a suit. This term, though, it's a political term. It's not a theological term or a sociological term. Evangelicals don't want a theocracy in America. Evangelicals just want to be left alone.
Freedom.
And so what the left does is they stigmatize a group. So what they'll say is like they want evangelicals to be fearful of engaging in the public square because they feel bad about it, right? They want to stigmatize the community from political activism. And secondly, they want to cause other Americans to be scared of evangelicals. And there was sort of something really, really interesting that happened in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on former President Trump, when the media began to sort of realize that the people in that audience were not these uneducated people from the middle of the country that were,
deplorables.
Deplorables. When the stands were filled with doctors and bankers and business people and firefighters, like those are the people. So evangelicals are like only politically active if you provoke them, if you try to take away their rights, if you try to suppress, their religious freedom, these sorts of things, they will come out. And when they come out, there's no group like it. But yeah, this term Christian nationalism, and before that it was like white evangelicals. It's like, oh no, those are just the white evangelicals. But evangelicalism isn't even a white movement in the United States of America. Every church I go to is there's many Black and Latino, and it's an international movement. There's no Christian movement around the world as diverse as the evangelical.
Oh, I mean, Dr. Jeff, you work with Gen Zers. That's the group that cares the most what people think about them, and so they are so afraid of being called a white Christian nationalist Barbie or something like that. Is that something that you're noticing there as well?
I see this in churches a lot. This is if there's a flaw in the way we're describing evangelicalism, it is that you have to seek popularity. If you want people to come to your church, you have to get them to like you.
Yes.
And so how do you make sure you get people to like you? And that is an ongoing conversation in Christianity, especially in evangelicalism. Well, it's especially true for young adults. So 2/3 of young adults today say they do not want to hold an opinion that differs from their peers, because being liked is the most important thing in a social media world. So they will ask then, well, what am I being taught in school, and how do I reconcile my Christianity with that? Rather than asking, how do I take my biblical faith and make what's happening in school fit? Right? So it's exactly the opposite. I'll just give you an example. I think a lot of young adults today, for example, they'll support anti-Israel efforts because they think Israel is a bully. And they were always told by their parents, you should not be a bully. And if you find a bully, you should turn them in, or you should stand against them, or whatever. That's good character to do that. A lot of people didn't realize that the education system and social media weaponized that belief and turned it into a sort of Marxist oppressor versus oppressed mindset. Where we want this dialectical conflict because that's how society advances. So you've got a lot of young adults who are now saying, well, how do I make my faith fit into that Marxist framework? Rather than saying that Marxist framework is bankrupt because it ignores the fact that anything exists other than the material world. It can never be right. So what we should be asking is, how do I take my biblical faith and use it to bring flourishing in places where Marxism has created total bankruptcy of society?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this phenomenon is it's so insidious because this is a generation that, for whatever reason, has been wired to help people. I mean, I always say they would walk barefoot over the Sahara Desert to like help one kid. And yet these political activists have managed to weaponize that good instinct in all kinds of dangerous ways. And as a student and a scholar even of Christian persecution around the world, like, I can tell you, all over this globe, there are persecuted Christians that are like shouting warnings to the United States of America, given what they're seeing. Number one, they need us as the United States,
That's right.
the most powerful country in human history, the wealthiest country in human history, based upon this foundation to continue to hold the line on religious freedom. But they're also seeing what happened to them start to happen here. So, you know, I don't like to draw parallels between Christians that were beheaded by ISIS and between, you know, being marginalized or stigmatized and, you know, still the freest country in the world.
Right. And by the way, that's not even a thing of the past. The Christians are persecuted right now all over the Middle East. And nobody is talking about that.
More Christians were killed in Nigeria last year in one country, and actually a few states of one country, than ISIS killed during the entirety of their caliphate when that was on the news all the time. But what people don't realize is the foremost persecutors of Christians are actually not the Islamists. They're number two, statistically speaking. The foremost persecutors of Christians were the communists.
Well, communists in general have killed more people than anybody.
But the way they hunted people of faith. And so when people outside of our country or within our country start seeing these like Marxist sort of ideas and instincts rise up, this only ends in one place. And that's what these persecuted Christians have told me all around the world. They, you know, not to draw parallels between beheadings and anything else, but they always say, it never started this way here. It started with our kids being treated differently in school. It started with us being treated differently at work. It started with lawfare, these weapons of the state in order to ask, then demand, and then force us to comply. And these are warning signs all over our country. But unfortunately, this ideology is being like delivered on a silver platter to a generation that should actually be changing the world.
It's delivered through the conveniences of technology and the internet, and I guess the soft words like social justice, where they just remove the word justice by putting the word social, I guess, in front of it, and it's not real true justice. You know, Dr. Jeff, you mentioned how our kids are being radicalized through this Marxist ideology, and you brought up the issue of Israel, and I know you ended up writing this entire book, which it actually surprised me that you wrote a book on Israel, because that is not what I associated your work with.
It surprised me too.
Right? I was like, suddenly I get a call and I'm like, oh, there's this book. Why did you? I have a hard time understanding why a tiny country on the other side of the planet with less residents than Los Angeles, the city, has become the focal point of the world, let alone our institutions here in the United States. And now you come about and you're also focused on writing about Israel. And so why so?
My interest, Marissa, is that Gen Z has been so indoctrinated on this issue that it's gotten to the point of being quite dangerous. A level of anti-Semitism we haven't seen since prior to the outbreak of World War II. And I saw it right after the October 7th terrorist attacks on Israel. I would have expected people would say to their Jewish neighbors, we've got your back. That didn't happen. Almost immediately, it was anti-Israel sentiment that was developed. And there were Christian organizations from liberal Christian churches that were actually a part of that. But it got to the point where 60% of young adults said they believed that Hamas's killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians and the taking of 254 hostages was justified because of Palestinian grievances. It was no longer just, we feel sorry for the beleaguered Palestinians. It was, Hamas is right, Israel is wrong. And that's why I wrote the book on Israel. I actually traveled there to the war zone, met people from the left, the right, secular, religious, everybody I could in between to try to figure out, how do I bring back a message of truth? Because what's happening is just sheer propaganda.
Hmm. Why do you think this propaganda is so prevalent here in the United States?
Oh, I think there are two reasons for it. And first, with Hamas, you saw Hamas unleash its propaganda campaign at the same time it unleashed its military campaign. I have a planning memo for the Students for Justice in Palestine group, which is a Hamas front group. I have a planning memo from the day of the attack where they held a conference call to outline what their strategy would be for the next.
They sent out identical instructions to groups all over.
So they knew exactly
the
what to
country,
say.
like,
This is how you're going, these are the words, this is how you're going to use it. But that fit in with the narrative of the progressive left saying, oh, everything in the world is oppressor versus oppressed. Israel is the oppressor because it has greater military power and greater wealth. It is a proxy of the United States. So ultimately, it is about the United States. So Israel is the outpost. If you don't feel comfortable attacking the United States as a whole, you can attack Israel. But young adults are even there. I mean, only 16% of young adults today say they feel proud to live in the United States.
Mm.
I mean, the exception, though, is the evangelical community. I mean,
Right.
What's remarkable is the evangelical community all around the world, in the United States, in countries like Brazil. I mean, even in Europe. I mean, we did a protest on behalf of the hostages 10 days after October 7th in Geneva. There were thousands of evangelicals there from Austria and Germany and Switzerland that just showed up. So the evangelical community, has formed this, like, I call it a firewall around the Jewish community.
Why?
Around the
Why
world.
are the evangelicals so supportive of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. And by the way, this Christian support of the Jewish community is not something we should take for granted. I mean, as a good Jewish friend of mine always says, about 75 years, every 75 years, someone decides they're going to take out all the Jews. And through most of history, it was a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in this like amazing fate of history, we have the fastest growing Christian community around the world that feels good about the Jewish community and about the state of Israel. And I'm a product of that. I mean, I grew up in South Carolina, a small town. I'm not aware I even met a Jewish person till I was an adult, but I was taught in these little churches that we stand up for Israel. We support the Jewish community. And I would say the support is basically three things. I always say this to rabbis that I speak to, that your book is our book. I mean, the what we call the Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Okay,
We take the Bible seriously. So
virtually every author of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, put it that way, is Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. I mean, there would be. I believe that they're two separate religions. I treat them as Judaism and Christianity. I treat them differently. But there's no Christianity without Judaism. Your book is our book. Your heroes are our heroes. When we tell our kids, the amazing PragerU video, that we collaborated on, which people should watch, about how they should read the Bible to their children. And in that video, we talk about how you teach courage to your kids through these biblical characters. When we talk about you can't serve Jesus if you care about the opinions of people. In the next sentence, we're talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing in the fiery furnace. Like your heroes are our heroes. And then number three, like, your values are our values. And we very often interpret those values differently. And yet the foundation of those values they're Jewish values. They're not Christian values. They're Jewish values. And this gets to the geopolitical point, because the front lines of all of these values of the nation state, of freedom, of good and evil, of right and wrong, they are Jewish values. When we say a Judeo-Christian country, that's what we mean. The ideas that brought us this amazing country in human history are Jewish ideas that were grabbed onto by Christians. And in the current situation in the world that we're living in, the state of Israel is the front lines of the attack against these values. And those organizations that are often funded by frankly, foreign countries, the Communist Party of China. There's an institute called the Contagion Institute associated with Rutgers University, did this just astonishing report, about 3 or 4 months ago, directly linking some of the propaganda, the anti-Semitic propaganda, to organizations connected to the Communist Party. I snuck into a protest, an anti-Israel protest in London in December last year, and what struck me the most was there were 7 or 8 tents organizing all the protesters right outside of the Bank station in London. And of those 7 or 8 tents, only 2 of the tents were Palestinian organizations.
It's the usual suspects.
The other 6 tents,
Socialistworker.org,
Socialist Workers Party of the UK, the Communist Party of the UK, the anti-Semitic signs that said from the river to the sea, at the bottom of the signs, they said the Socialist Workers Party of the UK. And in the United States of America, I was just reading the news one day, and in Idaho, the first In-N-Out burger was opening. And there were anti-Israel protesters outside the first In-N-Out burger opening. I forget which state. It was one of those 2 states. And they had signs that said from the river to the sea. And if you look carefully at the pictures from the protest, the sign has the Socialist Workers Party on the sign.
Socialist Workers Party is a Marxist party. It's a communist party. It's a Trotskyite communist group. They don't even have that many members. We were talking about this before the show. They only have a few thousand dues-paying members, but they have an enormous level of influence. If you go to the West Bank, you'll find a lot of people are supportive of Hamas, but you don't see them protesting in the streets like you do here. But if you ask them, what is Israel? They'll describe it as the little Satan. Then you ask them, what's the big Satan? It's the United States. Yeah, so for those who don't care about faith issues, that is something to keep in mind. But
it sounds like what you're describing is that as Americans, we have become so vulnerable to these terrible ideas that the Marxists have recognized that by brainwashing us through social media, through our education system, through our institutions, they can just turn everything upside down. And so it's not necessarily just about Israel. It's about an attack on us.
It's actually an attack.
Everything,
it's an attack on the West. That's what it is. And by the way, we should know better, because what's happening in the United States is what happened first in Europe. You spend a bit of time in Europe, and they always talk in Europe about the red-green alliance, the alliance between the Marxist organizations and between the Islamist organizations. And I'm not talking about the moderate Muslim friends of mine, all over the world, countries involved in the Abraham Accords and all of these things. I'm talking about organizations funded by various types of extremists, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, Muslim Brotherhood organizations, and they have found this alliance in Europe. On paper, this makes no sense. The socialist parties, the communist parties, they're socially liberal. These Islamist organizations are fundamentalist, and their conservatism makes no sense. The only thing that brings them together is they hate the West. They hate Western values. And what's remarkable about it is during one of the recent local elections in the UK, an Islamist won in this local election. And if you listen to the speech afterwards, he says he's won in order to support Palestine. It's not even about the UK, it's about Palestine. And then he says, then he attacks the Labour Party. He doesn't attack the Conservative Party, which are his real enemies, because what happens in this circumstance is they attach to their host on the left, and then they destroy that, and then they go after it. And we're starting to see this happen in the United States of America. And one of the reasons why it's happening here is because we are the most compassionate country in human history. We're the most generous country in human history. And some of these very, very insidious organizations, including funded by foreign governments, they have decided to use that compassion against us. And because we're not educated, if you don't know history, you will repeat it. And then it's all feelings.
So, I think many of us have known that the left is very dangerous to America, right? We all know about that. But now we're starting to see this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic narrative on the right as well. And so where is that coming from, including from Christians? I mean, just to be honest, it's not just the Catholics, but evangelical churches are siding with, these radical Hamas supporters. And so where is that coming from? How do you explain that?
I think it helps to understand how evangelical Christians see the world. It makes sense of why evangelical Christians would support Jewish people and support Israel. So we see the Bible as a meta-narrative, an overarching story of all of life, from the beginning to the end, creation, fall, redemption, that history is going somewhere and it's going there on purpose. So Christians then see everything fits into this. And that meta-narrative that fits with the Jewish faith goes back to Abram. In Genesis chapter 12, God says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. Whoever blesses you will be blessed. Whoever curses you will be cursed. Then they sign it as a covenant. Okay, a covenant, very solemn kind of agreement that you sign with your life. He made a sacrifice. He took the animal pieces and sacrificed them. And the idea was both parties to the covenant will walk through the middle as a way of saying, if I break this covenant, may what happened to this animal be done to me. And then when it was time for them to sign the covenant, God put Abram into a deep sleep, and God alone walked through the pieces. God, in fact, made a covenant with himself on behalf of Abram. That became the Jewish people. That covenant continued. There's always the covenant in the land, as you see that all throughout Scripture. Then you get to the New Testament. In Galatians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul says, those who believe in Jesus are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. So Christians see this tie between Judaism and Christianity that's inviolable. The problem ends up in the Christian churches when people say, no, Jesus was Jewish, but when he died as a Jew, but he rose again as a Christian. Judaism is no longer relevant. People call it supersessionism or replacement theology or fulfillment theology. But it diminishes the significance of Jewish people in God's story. And I think that's why it's dangerous.
That's the theological reason why it's dangerous. And I'll give a good theological explanation of why some Christians do this. And by the way, this has become the institutional position of some major Christian seminaries and institutions.
Wow.
Which, by the way, a lot of the critical theory that we're confronting that's causing all of this around our country and around the world, people don't understand that the source of critical and colonial theory are liberal divinity schools in the United States of America.
I'm really glad you're saying that.
They were inherently anti-Christian.
We have to expose them.
Yeah, I mean, if you just read the literature, it goes directly to the divinity schools. But from a political perspective,
well, I just want you to emphasize this point even further, because there are so many good Christians out there, and Jews too, who are sending their kids to divinity schools across the United States, Harvard, all the Ivy League schools. Parents don't realize that these schools have been taken over by Marxists. And so you're going to
for a long time.
You're sending your kids to a divinity school, and they're going to come out with a new god, the government. That is what happens there.
That's exactly right. And what's super interesting and tragic is that a lot of these schools were dying a natural death, because the way it works is if you sort of start taking your faith less seriously, then all that's left is sort of the social connections. And you don't need a religious community for those social connections. You just sort of blend in with culture. But what's happened is, in a response to what was used to be called the religious right, we have a very, very well-financed religious left. And so you have all kinds of organizations in America, and including also around the world, that had died a natural death. They're not influential organizations. They don't have a lot of following. They don't have a lot of leaders, but they have been given many, many, many millions of dollars in order to exist only as a political operation against the religious right. And sometimes they're very sophisticated. They make religious arguments. They make religious freedom arguments for themselves, and they say, I have the religious freedom to believe this way. And so some of the more interesting cases that are working their way up in our court system are these sorts of arguments. But when it comes to anti-Israel sentiment on the right, I mean, what we have to watch out for is we have part of this emerging so-called, sometimes they call it the new rights. It's the convergence of the libertarian sort of like movement,
the woke right,
and it is it seeks the total disengagement from America in the world. It's an isolationist movement. It's an anti-war movement, and it often finds its way in the American first sort of like rhetoric, but America first is not an idea of America only.
Right.
Okay. And yet I think that certainly wasn't the case in the Trump administration. It's not the case in the prevailing view. But there are some people on the right. They're trying to create an isolated America that disengages from the world. And so by being anti-war, they're anti the U.S. supporting Israel, anti the U.S. supporting all these other things, and then we have these Arab and Palestinian Christian communities that are appealing to the sensibilities of American and other Christians, saying that they're oppressed, all of these things by Israel. But what you have to understand is that, as is the case with all autocratic movements in history, any religious minority, living in the Palestinian Authority or in authoritarian countries like China, anytime they say something publicly, they know they're saying something with a gun to their head. And very often, I think some of the rhetoric that's coming out of these communities, it's not authentic anyhow. In fact, it's the exact opposite. They are crying for our help, and by somehow treating, I hate even saying it, but like justifying what Hamas did on October 7th based upon—
Or propping up the Palestinian Authority.
Despite its incredible corruption, like all of these things, that they're somehow helping the Christians that are living under this tyranny. It's the exact opposite. You're helping the oppressors by not holding the UN accountable for not creating a safe zone, as they were obligated to do, between Lebanon and between Israel, and therefore empowering Hezbollah. And somehow you're speaking up for Lebanese Christians. Like the exact opposite is true. Like, if you really, really, really want to look at this with clear eyes, here's a fact. Of all the countries in the Middle East, the only country where the Christian community has grown in multiple consecutive years in the Middle East is in Israel, a country that, by the way, not every Israeli is Jewish. 20% of Israel is Arab, and a lot of Arab Christians. So those are the actual facts. And so one of the things that really, really grieves me is when I see members of the Christian community hoodwinked as advocates for persecuted Christians be on the wrong side of this issue. And it all comes down to education. I think people need to know the issue. They need to read the books. They need to go to PragerU. They need to watch the videos, because the fact of the matter is we're living in a period of history where the institutions that are supposed to protect the vulnerable, that are supposed to be educating the next generation, they had a good plan. They hijacked those institutions first. So the human rights organizations and the UN and all these places, the countries that are on those commissions, are the worst human rights violators in the world. I mean, this is where we are.
I keep hearing about replacement theology, and it seems to become more popular. I never heard of that word before.
Well, replacement theology says that Jesus, when he came, made Christians, the church, the new Judaism, so that Jews are not relevant anymore. It's Christians from here on out. But in seminary, they'll call it supersessionism, and there's a hard and a soft.
That's just to confuse people.
Just yeah. Soft supersessionism is, we think Jesus is the savior, but we do think a lot of our Jewish brothers and sisters. Hard supersessionism says God divorced the Jews; they are irrelevant to anything God is doing in the world. That is an actual.
Is that a growing belief?
That is a growing belief.
I'll tell you the first tell is when someone says that Jesus was not Jewish, he was a Palestinian, by the way. And it comes from this like hard supersessionism. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, but like the denomination that's most responsible for this idea is the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the ELCA of America, Evangelical Lutheran Church. And this is actually the denomination of the governor of Minnesota, right? So when
Wait,
and now
Tim Walz?
Tim Walz, yeah, Tim Walz,
it's his church.
who's now the vice presidential nominee on one side of the aisle. Like when he talks about Christianity, which he does every once in a while, he's very careful. He says he's he's not very religious, but in his Christianity, he is a member of this congregation. And by the way, we have never had in American politics someone at this level that's a member of this denomination. And not a lot of people know this either, but like the anti-Semitic pastor from Bethlehem, Munther Isaac, he's the high priest of Christian anti-Semitism in our world. He speaks at churches all over the world and all these parliaments and everywhere.
Guess what denomination he's a part of?
Evangelical Lutheran Church. That's the denomination he's a part of. And we're actually looking at a church in the United States of America that, it's something that even fewer people know. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of America has participated in more than a dozen meetings with representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, including virtually every year at the United Nations when Iran sends their delegation to the annual UN General Assembly. They have a meeting of religious leaders on the side or civil society leaders, and there's almost always a senior leader of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. This is the engine of Christian anti-Semitism in our country and around the world.
And you may want to go deeper on
it. It is actually so frightening.
Yeah,
there's
and
an
so
organization.
when you see Ilhan Omar in Minnesota, and like, what is going on with all that? What is going on with all this? Well, look, we have religious communities that are substantially networked with Islamists all around the world. And if you don't understand theology, you won't quite see it. But there are Christian denominations here at the heart of the religious left that are driving these agendas.
And there is an organization that is made up of membership of a lot of the liberal Christian churches in the United States of America. Their messaging began on October 7th, that Israel is a colonizer, that
they were prepared.
Settlers.
They were prepared.
Right, that Israel's engaged in ethnic cleansing. They were prepared to release their information on the day of the attacks.
And I'm sorry, but like a lot of people on the right have been duped by this. Munther Isaac was a guest of Tucker Carlson, nonetheless.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. People want to seek truth and they want to hear from multiple perspectives. I think there's a lot of positive elements to freedom of speech, and it comes with people having to really do their homework. And when they hear things, not necessarily just believe it, even if it's one of our favorite, shows. I think being subject to hearing multiple perspectives puts the responsibility on you to actually go in deeper and really study things and go beyond that 1 hour of listening.
That's a culture of free speech. Free speech isn't just about everyone having the ability to say their point of view. It happens within the context of people that are willing to challenge and think about that and educate themselves on it.
Let me give you a simple way to do it. What do you mean by that? How do you know that's true? Where do you get your information? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Those are simple questions you can ask whenever you get new information to try to discern what the truth is.
Discernment is the key. That, by the way, is a theological word in Christianity. You're supposed to be discerning about everything. And, it's like really weird stuff happens in our culture. Like if you have an anti-Semitic pastor from Bethlehem on a conservative show, all of a sudden the left, which really, really hates people on that side of the aisle, like start touting those ideas. Like in this information age where we have more information available to us than the combination of all information in human history, we have to educate ourselves. And, it's one of the reasons why I think PragerU is so important, because there's like not a topic that we need to know about or that we should be thinking about, or that, all these questions that you gave us as a guideline, like just go to PragerU.com, search the topic, it's there.
Yeah. And not necessarily believe every single thing we produce, right? We want people to question what we produce. I mean, we'll give an alternative perspective to the common narrative and mostly ones that we obviously stand by. But I want to encourage people to understand that freedom of speech comes with a lot of responsibility.
That's right.
And that means that you got to put in the work. You really need to put in the work. It's not just about your favorite, you might love me, you might love Dennis, but you still need to put in the work even after I speak, even after any one of you speaks.
Yeah, and if we're not actually disagreeing sometimes, then we're not doing the work. I mean,
Right.
that's the beauty of America, right? And we can have these conversations, we can disagree, we can go back and forth on things, but you got to educate yourself.
A few years ago, we did a video called The Dark Art of Framing, where we talked about that. Everything that you see or hear in the media, TikTok, 40% of Gen Z gets their news from TikTok. Everything you see there is framed for you. So you have to ask, how do I broaden my understanding of what's actually taking place to know whether what's being framed for me is true?
And it's so much more fun that way. I mean, if you're a curious person, like, argue over stuff. Look, this is the way it should be.
It is the way it should be. But I think what happens in woke America is that more stuff gets put into the unspeakable category.
No, it's a religion.
It's
a religion. The woke thing is not like a political movement. It's a religion. They have their theology. They have their messiahs. Like, you can't. And it's a fundamentalist religion, by the way. If you're a heretic, if you don't see the world exactly,
it's highly judgmental.
Yeah. Dr. Jeff, you confront so many of the obvious questions that you're getting from young people. It's not just young people, but on the left and on the right when it comes to the issue of Israel. And I think, Johnny made some interesting cases. Even Lebanon used to be a Christian country. And so for people who love Christians, really, they should ask not just what happened in recent bombings over there, but where are all the Christians who used to live in Lebanon and Syria and so forth. But how do you answer those questions to when people say, well, Dr. Jeff, you're a Christian. How do you not care about the Christians that are dying in Lebanon? How do you not care about the young children that are dying in Gaza? How do you not have a heart for all of these humans that are dying in the hands of this Israeli war?
3 months after the October 7th attacks, I traveled to the war zone, and our group had a little bit of time with Rachel Goldberg, whose son Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, was brutally executed by Hamas as a captive. But she said something to me I thought was really powerful. She said, if you only care when one side's babies die, your moral compass is broken. I care about all of the people who are being victimized at the present time. And I believe that Hamas is the enemy of the Palestinian people as well as the enemy of Israel. I think Israel has been as surgical as they can be in protecting non-combatants in this time of war. But when I see people say, well, the Palestinian Christians are being attacked by Israel, it just isn't something that's true. I was just confirming some of the details with somebody I know who's there, who actually legally protects Palestinians. And he said, the exodus of Christians from the Palestinian territories began with the advent of the Palestinian Authority, not when Israel got involved. And it is the Palestinian Authority that says if you are Muslim and you convert to Christianity, you've earned the death penalty. There are thousands of arrests and illegal detainments and even torture and demeaning behavior toward Christians. And then if a Muslim sells a piece of property to a Christian or a Jew, they can actually be imprisoned for that.
Where?
And the trend in the West Bank.
Yeah.
Have you heard this from actual Christians, or did Jews and Israelis tell you this?
No, this is from, I can't give the source, but it's from a human rights activist who protects Palestinians in court.
Mm-hmm.
Which by the way is the difference between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Like, when any Christian has any minor problem in Israel for a good reason or a bad reason, like in any democracy, they're in the media. The government's having to answer questions. I mean,
it's true.
But in the
it's kind of chaotic.
But in the Palestinian areas, like this is absolutely the case. If they whisper a word of, if they post 2 words on social media, they will get the torture treatment. Okay, that is the situation. The same thing is true in Lebanon. Like if you look at the decline of Christianity in Lebanon, in the war that's going on, the Israelis killed Nasrallah, and then they killed his replacement, and then his replacement, and the whole council, and all these things. But there was one video that was sort of poking around on the internet that I'm not sure a lot of people saw. But it was the second replacement of Nasrallah, who had a job for about 24 hours. And he was threatening Lebanon's Christians. Because this is what these supremacist ideas do. And one of the reasons why Christians, there are lots of reasons why Christians speak up for the Jewish community, but there's a fact of history we have to recognize. What starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And I've seen it all over the world. In Iraq, you had a thriving Jewish community. And the Christians thought, this will never happen to us. In Syria, you had a thriving Jewish community. And the Christians thought, this would never happen to us. And you can track it all over the world. First, they took out the Jews, and then they took out the Christians. And if you don't have human rights, rule of law, address corruption, all of these Western democratic values, by the way, and sometimes we say Western, they're not actually Western, okay? Judeo-Christian ideas, the nation state, human rights, all these things. Christianity, it's a Middle Eastern religion, okay? Our home is the Middle East. It's not the West.
You don't have to be a prophet or a son of a prophet to see that if a nation begins to stand against God and against the Bible, this is the inevitable result. And that's what I'm trying with Gen Z, trying to get them to understand, is that when you say, I'm not proud to live in America because I hear all of this rhetoric on the right and on the left and everybody's so negative, the entire world is hoping that you will stand. The entire world is hoping, not that you'll be a flag-waving, proud American, but that you'll stand for what America's founders actually stood for. That you'll stand for the truth. That you'll stand for the facts in the situation, and you'll be able to discern the difference between persuasion and propaganda. All of that is desperately needed, and the world is counting on us.
There's a experience I had that illustrates this point. A few years ago, I wrote a book called The Next Jihad. It's about the persecution of Christians in Africa, where we have a piecemeal Islamist caliphate where whole villages are being burned to the ground, horrific things happening every single day, more Christians killed there than any other place in the world. And I just decided to show up in Abuja, in the capital of Nigeria. And within a couple of days, word got out that an American who cared was there. And I walked into a hotel room where I was supposed to meet the representative of a village that had been mowed down by jihadists. And I walked in the hotel room, and it wasn't a person representing the village. It was every man in the village had traveled over the same roads that their daughters had been kidnapped on, where the terrorists had run amok, just for the opportunity to tell their story to an American. Because we ought to be really proud that that's what we in our best represent, all over the world. And I remember, I told them, I don't know if I can fix your problem. I probably can't. But what I do promise I can do is I can tell your story.
Tell the story.
Yeah. What I think is so also fascinating with what's happening around the world with Christianity is that it's actually growing in Iran, which is shocking to me because on the one hand, I would think that they would be very scared to become Christians. And also I associate the current regime with not allowing the growth of Christianity, and, the Jews were kicked out of there. And so how do you reconcile that? A growth of Christianity in a country that is so intolerant towards Christianity? Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, the Islamic Republic of Iran persecutes the Baha'i community viciously, probably the most, but the second most persecuted community in Iran are Christians. And the irony, though, is that the best evangelist, let's say, that Christianity has had in the Middle East, in Central Asia, is the Ayatollah himself, because he has so defamed his culture and his religion. He has killed so many people. He's made it so miserable to live in that country, to where if a woman just takes a little bit of her
Masha
hijab,
Amini,
but just a little bit, and gets beaten to death, that flocks and flocks and flocks and flocks of Muslims who still believe in God, but don't see in Islam what they thought because of what the Ayatollah has demonstrated. They've decided to find faith in a different direction. And more than 1 million Shia
That's incredible.
Muslims have converted to Christianity. Over 50,000 little house churches, mainly led by women, proliferate across Iran. So we actually believe the fastest growing Christian community is in Iran. And I know as a matter of fact that on April 13th, which is when Iran first fired all those missiles and drones into into Israel, that there were Christian prayer meetings in Iran. And those Christians, evangelical Christians, were praying for Israel that the Iranian attack on Israel would fail. And by the way, in oppressed places all around the world, it's growing. There are more evangelicals in China than there are members of the Communist Party.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's just, and meanwhile, we're sitting here in the United States of America with our freedoms, and we are watching our students on campus rioting and protesting against Israel, against the United States of America. It is pretty shocking to think about that as you're describing what is happening in Iran versus what is happening here. I want to go back to the evangelical question that I started with, and that is, where are we with evangelicals? The election's coming up. Where do you think their heart and minds are, both on the young side and just as a community in general? Do you think that they're going to show up? Do you think that they're awake? Have they also been so abysmally confused?
So I think if we would have been having this conversation a month and a half ago, I probably would have a different view. But I've been traveling all around America, meeting with pastors in churches, doing these nonpartisan, sort of conversations about values and the obligation you have as a Christian to vote, because we believe that you have we believe God created 3 institutions. He created the family, the church, and government. These are these institutions were created by God, and we have an obligation as Christians to vote. And it's like non-optional. Like, I'm not saying who you should vote for, but you have an obligation to vote. And what I'm discovering actually all across America is I'm seeing pastors in some of the largest churches and some of the most unexpected places that have never before done a whole sermon or an effort to get their members to register to vote and to turn out to vote. And yet this year, they feel like that the world that we're living in, that the challenges that they're facing in their own communities requires that they put themselves as leaders in uncomfortable situations, and they speak up for the first time. And you know what's remarkable about it? I've yet to encounter a pastor of a church that when the pastor actually did a whole sermon on the importance of voting for your beliefs, for your commitments, of all this, a whole sermon. I've yet to meet a pastor that received the criticism they expected to receive. In fact, in 100% of the circumstances, people in the congregation, including donors in the congregation that they were fearful would stop giving if they got into politics, they go to the pastor, they go to leadership of the church, and they say, "What took you so long?"
Look at that. Courage pays off. Well, let me end with this, my Christian friends. The Jewish people brought the Old Testament to the world, but it's truly the Christians who brought the religion and the Bible to the entire world. And I think our partnership has been very, very significant in that. And I am very, very grateful to Christians who have been able to spread truth and goodness through the word of the Bible. And, especially to both of you who wake up every single day, risking your lives oftentimes to do good so that we do leave this earth at least as good as we found it, if not better. And so it's really an honor to be a friend of both of yours. And thank you.
Thank you, Marissa.
Marissa, I just have to add, like, what Christians also need is a bit of Jewish wisdom. Okay. And there are 2 quotes that I always carry with me everywhere I go around the world. And one is, where there are no leaders, be a leader. And another one is, it's not up to you to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. And by making the space for this conversation, by educating the entire world on these issues, that's what PragerU is doing. And I hope like many, many millions of people all around the world will decide to be a leader when they look around and they don't see any.
Yeah, and have that courage.
I want people to stand for the truth. I want the rising generation to stand for the truth. I really think the indoctrination and propaganda is a real problem, conspiracy thinking and so forth. I don't know if there's this is awkward to work this in, but the book you were talking about, Should Christians Support Israel, is available for free. I'm just giving that book to anybody who wants it. I don't care how many people request it.
Yeah.
Just go to summit.org/Israel and you can get a copy of it for two reasons. First of all, to understand the Israel of your Bible and the Israel of history. But second of all, to understand how to help the rising generation not be indoctrinated. How do you help them not be taken captive? How do you help them be set free from the captivity of the ideas that they have faced all of their lives?
Yeah, and it's a short, quick read, but I would say that the people who actually should read this are people who are very critical of Israel, right? And so that they can at least equip themselves and say, well, I read the case for Israel and I made up my own decision, right, about the issue.
They make up their own mind. And, I've done a lot of Q&A sessions with young adults this summer, maybe half of whom were critical of Israel. But they told me, we're tired of just watching videos about this. We want to actually read a book. Right. And I just thought, that alone is a hopeful sign.
That alone is a sign that the world is truly turning upside down again and again. Well, friends, thanks again for being here, and thanks for everything you do. I'm sure we'll be spending a lot more time together in the future, but it's been very enjoyable to me and inspiring.
Thank you, Marissa.